and good evening. Thank you very much for coming out tonight to listen to me and my talk. I am a PhD student at the University of Auckland Business School, and my research topic and area of focus is on something that could be seen as something being rather controversial. Businesses are in business to make profits, right? But my research focuses on an area where businesses are in business beyond profits and not just necessarily focusing on making money for the sake of making money, but considering the promotion of overconsumption reduction. And I've brought with me tonight a pair of nylon stockings. And I believe some of the women among us might actually know what I'm heading towards. Nylon stockings are a classic example of planned obsolescence, where firms actually ask us pretty much to consume more and more because firms make these products to actually break down. And planned obsolescence, or companies choose to make it planned or make it obsolete because they believe, or they tell us, that they are improving in a way the products over time. And we see that very strongly happening, for example, in mobile phones industry, where mobile phones are actually being replaced over time, like every couple of years because of new features coming in, or our existing phone, for example, not being as functional as it was or very slow over time. So the mobile phone or electronics industry is one example, but it also applies very strongly to the fashion industry. Because in the fashion industry, we're not necessarily thinking about features per se, but we're replacing our wardrobe with new cuts, new colors, and new sort of seasonal products that companies convince us to buy. Could I see a show of hands within the room, within the audience? Do any of you feel like that you have been consuming too much, or have you made possibly, or have you had any regrets in terms of purchase that you've made in the past? Anyone? Oh, great. Okay, cool. Well, you're not alone. Marketing seems to be working really, really well to convince us that we need to buy something that we actually don't really need. And even when we unintentionally actually go into a shop and don't really want to buy something, we see something and we really like it because of the new cut, the new style, the different colors, and then we choose actually to buy something even though we didn't really want to. And that leads us in a way to over-consuming products that we actually don't really need. And I've brought with me another sort of prop, a pair of pants. Because when we go into these shops, what we don't really often look at is actually what is happening behind the shop in terms of like what happened before it actually arrived in a shop, in terms of the supply chain, or whether it has been ethically made. And when we look at, for example, this pair of pants here, just by looking at it from the outside, would you be able to see if it was ethically made? Could you make a decision on that? Not really necessarily, because often the outside really doesn't show that something has been ethically made. We usually have to look much, much closer into the sort of fabric in terms of, for example, the tag inside the pants that will give us maybe an indication whether it has been ethically made. But also at the same time, this might not 100% give us an indication whether it was ethically made. Sometimes also the brand name might give us an indication whether it was ethically made. And the T-Fund report that comes out now every year after Rana Plaza gives us in a way an indication in terms of like what companies sort of have improved in terms of their ethical operations. But another indicator could also be seen in terms of the price. I'm not necessarily referring to that ethical fashion, for example, needs to be very expensively made and hence very pricey. I'm rather referring to the other end of the price spectrum in terms of how cheaply something has been made, because that raises questions in terms of how it is possible, if we're considering the whole supply chain, how something can actually only cost between $5 and $10. Because when we look at the farmers growing the cotton and then mulling the fabric and then making it in the end into a t-shirt, sending it or shipping it to New Zealand, and then it ending up in a New Zealand store, we actually don't really consider all these costs included when we consider ethical fashion. So there are a lot of sort of problems within the fashion industry that I've started to talking about, and one of them certainly is the affordability of fashion, because since World War II, we have so much more disposable income that we never had before to be able to actually spend money on things that we either want or not necessarily need. And also the product choices have so much increased. We're now having so many more levels in terms of like quality levels. We have different sort of features for similar products. We have different sort of price ranges even for similar products. It allows us to really like pick and choose and decide on the right product for us personally. But also advertising tries and convinces us to actually have the possibility to experience a product by actually purchasing it. And the experience can relate to, for example, being happier by having a product, or being more joyful, or like having a really good sort of experience just by having this product. The fast fashion industry is producing about 100 billion garments every year. If we would divide that by the current amount of the Earth's population, which is currently 7.6 billion, it would mean that each one of us would be able to purchase 13 pieces of clothing every year. But bear in mind, not everyone on this planet is able to afford actually a piece of clothing, or 13 pieces of clothing. And a study within the European Union found that we actually, within the Western world, or a more richer world, are able to actually purchase 13 kilos of clothing every year. So that links sort of to the question, well, when a company produces, or when companies, fast fashion companies produce 100 billion garments every year, they need to sell them somehow. So obviously companies try and convince us that our current wardrobe is not trendy enough anymore. Right? So we have to replace our current wardrobe with what is currently trendy and seasonal. And an average Zara garment, for example, is only worn 6 times in its life. And 30% of what we have currently in our wardrobes has never been worn within a year. Maybe that rings a bell for some people here. Certainly does for me. Okay, so there is a documentary that has been shown on TV New Zealand last year, and maybe some of you might have watched it. It was called War on Waste and has been renewed also this year again. Focuses on various sort of waste and pollution problems within Australia. And one of the problems that were discussed in one of the episodes was the fast fashion industry. And it was obviously talking about how much it's actually polluting the environment within Australia, but also at the same time it was very strongly focusing on the social pressure that especially young people are exposed to within the fashion industry. So the presenter of the show was following a few teenagers around, and they were going shopping every week to actually buy something new, because they told him that they can't be seen wearing something twice or being photographed with it twice, because when it's up on social media, they can't be seen because of the social pressure to be wearing something for another time. So there's sort of, this huge social pressure around the perception of what other people might actually think when we wear something more than once. Another third issue that is related to the fashion industry, and specifically that we're very much more and more aware, is related to production and labor issues. And the Rana Plaza incident in 2013 had a huge sort of media attention around becoming more aware of the working and labor conditions within the fashion industry. However, there has been after this Rana Plaza incident, there has been this building of a Bangladeshi Fire and Safety Accord that you might have heard about. And companies were able to join very voluntarily this accord to actually improve working conditions of employees within Bangladesh. At that time, after Rana Plaza happened, over 200 companies joined this Bangladeshi accord. However, 5 years later, in 2018, the Bangladeshi accord actually expired, even though not all the work was done. And there are still a lot of issues within the Bangladeshi worker and garment industry in general. And signing now this sort of transitional accord that came to place after the old one expired, companies were again not really having the force or being forced to actually being part of this accord. So what was very visible within 2013 and 2018 was, 2013, more than 200 companies joined, whereas in 2018, only 140 companies joined. And that raises a question in me in terms of like, have these companies done enough to actually possibly avoid another Rana Plaza? Or have they put regulations or policies for themselves put in place to avoid another Rana Plaza? What we're also sometimes overlooking is actually materials that are part of our garments, obviously. And there are certain consequences that we might not always see. And there is, for example, consequences to the environment with materials. There's consequences to the workers that are working with the materials, as well as to the end consumer. In terms of consequences for the environment, I guess a lot of you might be very aware about how many natural resources it takes to actually make clothing. As an example, when we want to make a T-shirt, for example, we need about 2,700 liters of water. To make that a bit more visible, it's about 2.5 years of drinking water for one person. And we only need, or we need 2,700 liters just to make one shirt. Another consequence is, for example, on the water, and on the workers. In terms of employees, where you might have maybe watched the True Cost movie, which explains really, really well in terms of how workers are necessarily are exposed to toxins. And when you're working with cotton and you're not necessarily having the right protection, it can actually cause a lot of diseases, but also cancer, which is very vividly shown also in the movie. A third consequence is also to us end consumers, that we're often not really made aware of, or possibly not necessarily being educated about. And that is in relation to, that I actually didn't even know. When I first started doing my research, I was contacting all these companies, and the companies actually made me really aware around what negative influences actually, even though we're not necessarily exposed to the toxins, like the pesticides that are used by the workers, we're still, in the end, also affected by it. And I found also that certainly our skin, because it's very permeable, we're putting cream on it and it absorbs it, but also at the same time, skin is not only absorbing creams, it's also absorbing our clothing, or particles of our clothing, which in some cases can be rather sort of a lower consequence in terms of just getting a rash. But in other areas or other consequences could be that we might be getting cancer from it. So we don't seem to worry too much in our daily lives about what is actually going on necessarily, or how it could actually negatively affect us. And there is a quote by a French writer that I really actually like that fits within this area here, but also many other areas. And it's by Voltaire, and it's called, "No snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible." And it actually, it fits really well with the fashion industry, or even within other industries. Maybe you've watched the news on Sunday when there was a report about the current banning of plastic straws, where some companies have completely banned, or some bars or cafes have completely banned plastic straws, but there are still a lot of bars that are still trying to phase them out over the next 5 years or so. And the government doesn't necessarily want to regulate it. And what the government really much wants to see is that there is sort of a driving force from the bottom up, from the individuals, from the consumers, to actually drive change. And that is sort of like very visible also within the fashion industry. We sometimes as consumers think that individually we might not necessarily be able to make a change, but there is actually a possibility if there's more people than just one of us thinking about the same sort of problems. There is just one person that we need to actually make a change, and then often a lot of people follow. And even in movies, like for example Elysium, it is described as sort of in a post-apocalyptic sort of scenario where it is talked about how we already actually sort of messed up our planet because we used up all the resources, and yeah, there's not really anything livable anymore. So we see already sort of in the portrayal of movies what sort of a negative impact we actually have on the planet, and that we most probably won't be able to live here in future. However, there are, from the bottom up, some sort of consumers that actually try and make a change. And these sort of consumers are often characterized as anti-consumers. And there is a type of anti-consumer that chooses to voluntarily completely simplify. And this category is also called voluntary simplifiers. It means that those are usually individuals that choose to live very simply, grow their own veggies, don't really buy anything in the supermarket, but rather live very sufficiently by themselves. But also, on the other hand, there is the consumer that is more active and is trying to actually make a change more proactively, more not necessarily negatively, but tries to push boundaries, and those are usually the boycotters. However, there hasn't been really a lot of boycotters that have made really a lot of change specifically in the fashion industry. But there have been a couple of examples where there have been more positive sort of examples. Like, for example, in the late 1990s, Nike was very much in the media about its sweatshop labor sort of problems that it had. And the company had pretty much two choices, either to continue the way it did or to change. And the company realized, because of the huge media attention that actually it got in terms of media attention, that sweatshop labor is something extremely bad that a company should never do, the company actually decided to turn it around for themselves, because they realized that it actually negatively influenced the profits as well as the reputation. So the company made it more and more transparent and visible to consumers what they are actually doing and how they are trying to resolve the problem around sweatshop labor. And over the last 20 years, it actually has reduced its sweatshop labor to just a few % overall. Also, in terms of the company, did not necessarily only see the transparency as a potential to grow its strategy, but also the company used sustainability to actually use it more as an opportunity instead of often as a challenge like other companies might see it. And that actually really strongly differentiated the company from other companies, because they are now seen pretty much as a leader in sustainability, because they're using plastics or recycled plastics to actually make clothing or shoes from them. Another example that has not gained as much sort of positive feedback from media as well as consumers is another fashion company called Gap. And Gap has also been exposed to very negative media on child labor or child sweatshops on using children in India. What the company only did was they just banned all the child-made sort of products, and that was it. So they didn't really use it necessarily as an opportunity to change the business around. And even though we have a lot of negative examples, and they are just countless, you can just really look up the internet and see more and more examples that are coming up where companies have been exposed to consumer or negative consumer behavior that resulted in some sort of responses by companies. There have been also companies that have been coming up to want to create a change. And this movement specifically is called slow fashion. And slow fashion is in stark contrast to fast fashion, because fast fashion focuses on a very quick turnaround time of clothing by bringing into the stores new clothing about 2 or 3 times a week. Whereas slow fashion focuses more on slowing down consumption in terms of consumption of consumers, but also the company consumption along the supply chain, as well as slowing down the production. However, we as consumers, why should we actually believe a company that just suddenly wants to slow us down? Isn't that just another sort of marketing gag they want to try on us to just convince us that we should just buy from them? And that is sort of a question that in a way makes sense, because companies in the past have really blatantly lied to us. When we think, for example, in 2015, the VW false advertising on environmentally friendly diesel cars. Or think about Red Bull that told us if we drink the energy drink, we're going to fly or get wings. And also think about Skechers. They made us believe if we just wear their shoes, we don't have to hit the gym. We're just going to burn calories by wearing them, and we're going to get a body like Serena Williams. Well, transparency overall is key for companies. Because slow fashion businesses try and usually differentiate themselves from the fast fashion companies by actually trying to be as transparent as possible, and as well as how they usually react towards the press as well as the media. What sort of suppliers they might choose and what sort of materials they might choose, but also the sort of different marketing they might do. And a very visible and very prominent sort of example is Patagonia, an outdoor clothing retailer in the United States. The company has been really in the press for over 40 years now, and sort of trying to shock consumers, governments, as well as other companies. And I told you about the example of Nike actually turning it around. The company, Patagonia, did pretty much the same thing, just a bit differently. They weren't made aware of their problems. They actually found the problem themselves. So a few years ago, about 10 years ago, the company also found problems along their supply chain. They also found that they had sweatshop labor, they had workers being exploited, workers being exploited. And what the company did was, which is something sort of very unique, is that the company didn't try to hide it. Because what the usual response is by companies is that they try and hide it. But the company went public onto the media and told the public about their problem. And also got in contact with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to actually find a solution to the problem. And a few years later, the company solved the problem completely. And there was no sweatshop labor along their supply chain. At the same time, while actually really digging into their supply chain, they developed a map on their website, which is called the Footprint Chronicles. And you as a consumer or a customer, you have the possibility to really see what the company actually does in terms of like, where are the products produced, how are they produced, how many people are working in the factory, etc., etc. So you have really sort of a very transparent idea about what the company does. And it's one of the only examples that I really know about where a company has done that on such a large scale, because Patagonia is not necessarily a small company. Another example of sort of Patagonia's different way of marketing, for example, is the advertisement that they do. And in 2010, maybe some of you know, they had an advertisement in the New York Times on Black Friday, the biggest shopping day in the United States, which is just after the day of Thanksgiving, where actually people say thanks for everything that they have. But the next day, they run into the shops, we gotta get this bargain. So they tried with this advertisement to shock consumers, to not necessarily make consumers stop to consume, but actually to really rethink, do we really need to buy something new? Don't we have already something like that in our closet that can be used? So like sort of this conscious, responsible sort of consumption thinking that we should have. Another example is a company in the Netherlands. that has also tried to do a bit of sort of different marketing, as well as has a sort of different business model. A company is called Mud Jeans, and it makes denim jeans. And instead of the consumer just going to buy a pair of jeans, the consumer has the chance to actually lease a pair of jeans. Now, leasing is usually something that we would see for cafes, maybe, cafe areas, maybe some sort of shops, as well as maybe cars, but not necessarily in the clothing industry. And they thought it might be just a good idea, instead of just selling something to consumers or producing it, marketing it, selling it, and then the consumer throwing it away. If they give the option to consumers to lease it, they actually have a lot of control in the end in terms of where the end product goes when it's not wanted anymore by the customer. And with a fee of, I can't remember how much, but you have to pay an annual fee, and then the company gives you the option to just get a pair of jeans sent. And after a few months or so, if you feel like you don't want to have this pair of jeans anymore, or you feel like you've worn it enough and you need something new, they give you the option to just send it back to them and swap it with another type of jeans that they have. So sort of like a very different sort of business model, but giving the company really the control and authority about what happens to the clothing. And they have an amazing sort of recycling program where actually consumers can see in their video how they recycle products. So you have really the option to understand how they recycle, which sometimes is not transparently enough shown. And a third company that also focuses more on longevity of products, and that was sort of their first tagline overall, is to have a product that actually lasts for over 30 years. And the company is a UK-based menswear brand, and it's called Tom Cridland. And they have, or they brought out with their first sort of products, the 30-year sweatshirt. And they have widened the spectrum also with pants and other T-shirts and stuff to really provide customers with the option to buy something once and keep it for a long time, and providing something that doesn't necessarily go, or is going out of trend. So overall, what is strongly visible within the sort of slow fashion movement is that there is a decision-making, as well as the values within the companies are strongly focused on an anti-consumption sentiment, so trying to reduce overconsumption, trying to make consumers very aware, and that is very strongly visible also in the education that they provide to customers. So what we see is, in comparison to fast fashion companies, slow fashion companies will also provide a lot of information on, for example, how something was made, or sort of other issues that are arising within the fashion industry, instead of just focusing on selling more products. So the relationship between customer and company goes beyond the sort of transactional relationship that we know about, which is visible in the longevity of the products that they make, the high quality, as well as their commitment to adopting certifications, like, for example, organic cotton certifications like GOTS, or by changing in a way or adopting the business model that companies currently have. And there has been a certification that sort of adapts your business model in a way, which is called a B Corp certification. Now, B Corp is similar to a fair trade certification, sort of. Because it focuses also on parts of the supply chain to ensure that this part of the supply chain has no worker issues or labor exploitation or child labor issues. And we see fair trade certifications, for example, for the cocoa industry, or for example in coffee. Now, coming back to B Corp is very similar to that, because it also has the focus on the supply chain. But it's not only certifying the supply chain of the firm, it actually certifies the whole organization, meaning that within the organization, the company commits to not just being profit-oriented, but having also social as well as environmental purpose. And what is very unique about B Corp is that companies actually have to sign a declaration that states that they won't just look after shareholder value or fulfilling shareholder value, but the companies have to also vouch to commit to social as well as environmental concerns. And that sort of certification is not just within the United States, but it's actually all around the world. And it's also actually here in New Zealand in parts. So there are a few companies, like, for example, We Are, that are B Corp certified. And you might also know, for example, another B Corp that is actually quite widely known, which is Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream is also a B Corp. However, you might think, because it was sold to another company, that then the B Corp certification might not actually be able to be transferred to this new company. But with the declaration that the companies sign, they actually commit towards actually also promoting sort of the B Corp certification. And the company can't just change its overall mission. The mission is set now for the future. So to wrap up, slow fashion provides us consumers with sort of an alternative to fast fashion. When we want to think about what we want to wear, for example, in the long term, or whether we're concerned about what something's made out of. And by slowing down our personal consumption habits, we are able to actually have a more sort of valuable relationship with our clothes. Because nowadays, or in many areas, we're actually discarding clothes very, very quickly, and we're not building sort of a relationship with our clothes that we maybe used to. Because we sort of share memories also with these clothes. When you think about certain days, or when you see, for example, your piece of clothing, whether it's a shirt or a pair of pants in your wardrobe, you might actually remember a certain day in your life that you were extremely happy. So slow fashion advocates to move away sort of from mindless towards more mindful consumption. So yeah, thank you very much. Any questions? Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
If anybody sees any hands, could they just let me know and I'll bring the mic through. Yeah, we have a question.
Hi there. I'm curious about the leased jeans. Mm-hmm. Do they get cheaper the more time, the older they are, kind of thing? The more times they've been returned?
Oh, thank you very much for the question. That is a really interesting question. I think that could even be considered for the company in future, actually. So far at the moment, when you lease a pair of jeans, you usually get a new pair of jeans. So the cost of leasing over the year actually always stays the same. So the company then decides when, for example, it gets swapped back to them, that they are usually reusing the jeans for a different purpose or actually recycling it. Like, for example, they might choose, instead of actually giving it to another person, to upcycle it and give it another purpose, like making it into a pillow. But so yeah, the price for the leasing actually stays the same at the moment. But yeah, absolutely, it could be something to be considered in future. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Oh, I'll come around. Sorry.
Thanks for your talk. I'm curious what advice you have for consumers in terms of evaluating the truth of the claims that companies make. I'm thinking about the fiasco with the World brand claims about being made in New Zealand. So how, as consumers, can we trust that these aren't just marketing kind of gloss and know that we're making good choices?
Oh, thank you very much. That is an absolutely great question. And that is really a problem that we're exposed to, because we don't really necessarily have any sort of certifications that we can sort of really trust, because there are hundreds and hundreds of certifications that all claim, oh, it's more organic, etc., which makes it really hard to make a really good purchasing decision. But there are some certifications that people can rather trust if they want to make a purchasing decision in terms of the clothing of a company. And that would be, for example, GOTS or a B Corp certification, because they have really audits within companies, and they come by and really check what is actually happening in the company. And within B Corp specifically, it is actually so that also the company in terms of marketing as well as the company per se. So not only its suppliers are looked after in terms of like whether they are doing the right job, it's also about whether the company is actually doing sort of the right thing in terms of providing consumers with an honest product. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question in terms of, I'm over here, in terms of what you're talking about for slow fashion and the contrast between that and faster paced fashion and lower prices. Unfortunately for a lot of people, slow fashion at this point of time is simply the cost of that is inhibitive for a large majority of the population. So what I was hoping to get from you is your thoughts on how it is possible either through pricing or through messaging to kind of bridge that economic demographic gap to make slow fashion more appealing or more accessible to the masses.
Very good question. Thank you very much. I think within consumption sort of patterns that we have acquired through company marketing specifically, we actually have such like sort of quicker sort of pace in terms of like how we purchase products. When I talked to my mom in the beginning about my topic, she actually told me about how she, when she was growing up, actually when she was making purchases, and she remembered that she had sort of like this aim to get this Levi's pair of jeans, and which cost her at that time about 60 euros. And she decided to save up the money. And I think when we have to make a decision in terms of like either something fast fashion or something rather slow fashion, we should consider more in terms of like, for example, is it something that I'm going to wear over a long time? So sort of like having a more conscious purchasing process. And I think making this more appealing to consumers by showing also consumers different options of where and how they could possibly wear it. Because usually we just see with the fast fashion particularly, oh, this is just this one-off sort of dress or T-shirt that we just wear this one time for going out, for example. But providing consumers with like how they can actually mix and match in the end. I hope that answers the question.
Hi, great talk, thank you. I was just wondering, if more of us buy less, which is what we really want, less resources, etc., how does that and what's happening to affect the people that work in those industries and keeping them in jobs?
Very good point, thank you very much. It does not necessarily mean that they are negatively affected just because they might have sort of less work, but they might actually get sort of a fairer pay that they might not necessarily get right now. Companies that are in slow fashion not necessarily market to the masses in that sense. It is sort of a very unique sort of way of actually dressing yourself. And I think that is something that we're moving towards in future, that we don't necessarily want to look like everyone else. And that allows then companies or workers specifically to not just produce hundreds and hundreds or thousands even of the same sort of shirt, but actually produce sort of a smaller quantity of products, but within a larger amount of time for a fairer wage, which might actually in the end possibly balance itself out, maybe. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Do you know roughly what is the price of getting a certification? Because it's very restrictive for a lot of the businesses that are actually in developing countries to actually get a certification to be exported and sold as fair trade. And it doesn't make sense for a small business like them.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. Absolutely right in terms of like there is a lot of pricing usually involved if you want to be certified in some way, whether it's just fair trade or if it is B Corp. I think in the end it just depends on the company in terms of like what they think might be just right for them in terms of their size. So I've been talking to companies that have been rather small, and they decided for themselves that they wanted to have a B Corp certification, which cost them about 500 New Zealand dollars a year. And they decided for themselves because they thought that this is the most sort of trustworthy certification that is available at the moment. But at the same time, a B Corp certification opens up a wider community that people are actually engaging in, or company owners specifically are engaging in. So they have this resource of sharing and mingling with other business owners that are also B Corp certified. So I think in the end, really, it depends on what you want to get out of the certification and what as a company you think would be best to position yourself. Thank you.
I was wondering what you would think then of the second-hand market for clothes, because that's quite a big thing in Auckland, and I see that every little suburb now has at least one or two hospice, a hospice shop and another shop, an op shop, and I think a lot of people who don't have much money only shop in those shops. They don't even go into new shops because it's quite outside their price range.
Absolutely, that is very true what you're saying, and. Second-hand shops are, in so far, also a slower fashion option because you're not necessarily, as a company, the company's not producing anything. So hence it is, in a way, a zero-waste sort of option for people to actually have cheaper fashion, but at the same time also giving something that has been living at the moment or has had a life cycle to extending this sort of life cycle at the same time. I've also been in touch with companies that specifically actually use op shops to actually make upcycled clothing. And that is also obviously then a business opportunity because there's so much clothing that's just available, that's just sitting in those op shops and no one really buys it, that actually provides us with opportunities to work with it in some way, whether it is upcycling it and making it into a new dress, for example, or a new shirt, or making it into bags, whatever it might be. So, yeah. Thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, sweet.
All good? Thank you very much.